The gym pulsed with a certain rhythm, metallic clinks of dumbbells, sneakers squeaking against the rubber floor, and the heavy bass of trap music thudding through the speakers. It was a place of youth and vanity, drenched in self-improvement, yet often bloated with ego. Mirrors stretched across every wall, not just reflecting bodies, but insecurities, challenges, and sometimes the unspoken competition between generations. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Zayden Cross moved through this jungle of muscle and motivation like a king in his domain. At 15 he was lanky but wiry, with the kind of natural agility that made him fast on the court and faster with his tongue. Biracial black mother, white father, he carried a restless swagger, always orbiting attention like a moth to flame. With his hoodie half-zipped and his phone clutched in hand, Zayden was more concerned with recording his life than living it. The gym wasn't just for games, it was a stage. He was surrounded by a small orbit of teenage peers. Trent, who never stopped flexing, Jalen, who rapped under his breath between sets, and Micah, who stayed glued to the squat rack while pretending not to watch the girls stretching across the way. Their bond was stitched together with memes, pre-workout, and inside jokes that often carried an edge. At first no one noticed the old man. He shuffled through the glass doors slowly, his back bent slightly like a question mark. His clothes hung loose on his wiry frame, an old gray sweatshirt, faded track pants, and sneakers that had seen better decades. A duffel bag hung from one shoulder, the strap fraying. His name was Silas Boone, and at 83 he moved like someone who had wrestled time and lost. Each step was deliberate, as if his bones whispered reminders of every year he had survived. Silas didn't glance around. He didn't need to. The looks found him anyway. Jalen was the first to speak, voice low but not low enough. "Bro, who let their grandpa in here? He gonna lift or knit?" Micah snorted, his laugh short and sharp. Zayden turned, curious. When he saw Silas approach the dumbbells with trembling fingers, he immediately pulled out his phone. "Yo, I gotta get this," he whispered, already opening his camera. As Silas bent down, his hands trembled, a slight involuntary shake that betrayed either nerves or illness. He tried to lift a small dumbbell, no heavier than 10 pounds, but his grip faltered. It slipped and rolled away with a soft thud. Instead of helping, a few chuckles echoed nearby. The music got louder. No one on staff intervened. It wasn't just ageism. There was something else in the air. Something quieter, but more insidious. The jokes took on a racial undertone. "Old head looked like he's from some slavery flashback," Trent muttered under his breath. Zayden didn't flinch at the comment. He'd grown numb to that kind of talk, unsure whether to defend, deflect, or disappear into the laughter. Silas, for his part, kept his eyes on the floor. He reached again, slower this time. When he finally managed to grip the dumbbell, his arms began to shake. Every tendon looked like it was stretched too thin, fighting invisible weights far heavier than the iron in his hands. Zayden's phone was still recording. "Yo, look at this," he whispered, narrating under his breath. "This man out here, doing Parkinson's curls." The video captured the tremor in Silas's limbs, the way his sweatshirt clung to his skeletal arms. But more than that, it captured his eyes, distant, haunted, but not broken. There was no humiliation in them, only history, history no one cared to ask about. A personal trainer walked by, glanced briefly, then kept moving. A front desk employee adjusted the music, now blasting even louder. The environment had absorbed the mockery like water into dry earth. No one challenged it. No one noticed the old man grinding his teeth, not from pain, but from the thick silence wrapped around him like a noose. Zayden hit stop on the recording. "This gonna go viral," he said, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Gym fail. Watch." Just then Silas straightened, slowly. His breath was heavy, like each inhale cost him more than just air. Without a word, he unzipped his sweatshirt and peeled it back with effort. His undershirt clung to his frame, but what stood out wasn't his frailty, it was his left forearm. The skin was weathered, but clearly visible were 5 faded numbers, tattooed in dark ink. They weren't stylish, they weren't decorative. They were crude, stretched and slightly slanted, as if etched in haste and cruelty. 8. Zayden blinked. "What the hell?" Jalen murmured, now staring. Trent leaned closer. "Is that what is that?" The numbers didn't make sense to them. Not yet. but someone else nearby had stopped lifting. A Marine veteran in his 30s, broad shoulders, crew cut, and a scar down his temple stood frozen mid-rep, his dumbbell hovering mid-air. His eyes locked on Silas's tattoo, and in that instant, his expression changed. Curiosity evaporated, and what replaced it was something raw. Recognition, grief, even guilt. Silas, unaware or uncaring, sat on a bench and began to breathe deeply, almost like meditation. The weight of the room had shifted. The Marine set his dumbbell down, without a sound. Zayden turned off his phone. He hadn't uploaded the video yet, but something told him deep down that he shouldn't. And yet he couldn't look away from that tattoo. It was old, real, and terrifyingly out of place. Micah finally whispered, "That ain't no regular tattoo, is it?" Silas adjusted his sleeve, but not before revealing a glimpse of something else just below the numbers. Faint scarring, a shape, a burned-in emblem. It looked like an eagle, but not the American kind. And then Silas spoke. Not to the boys, not to the room, but to himself. "Some things," he said quietly, "should have been buried deeper." The words hung there, barely audible, yet they rippled through the space louder than the music ever could. Zayden suddenly felt cold. He'd mocked a man he thought was weak, fragile and outdated. He hadn't mocked age, he had mocked history. And the history was staring back at him, through a barcode branded in flesh. As the music faded into background noise, and the crowd dispersed into murmurs, the Marine slowly approached Silas, his eyes wide with recognition and dread. Without a word, he knelt before the old man, and whispered something no one else could hear. Silas's eyes didn't shift, but one tear escaped down his cheek. Zayden stood frozen, unsure whether he had just filmed a joke, or a war crime that had never truly ended. For a moment time seemed to stretch in every direction. The mirrors no longer reflected pride or postures, just faces frozen, confused, and slightly unsettled. The rhythmic hum of dumbbells, the buzz of jump ropes slapping against rubber floors, the bass-heavy music all began to recede as if the room itself held its breath. Conversation stopped mid-laugh. Earbuds were quietly removed, and eyes one by one turned to the numbers inked on Silas Boone's forearm. Zayden's hand slowly dropped to his side, phone forgotten. The smirk he wore just minutes ago had drained into something resembling shame. Micah scratched his head, pretending not to look too long. Jalen shifted uncomfortably, as if trying to backpedal from the cruelty that now felt far too visible. And then there was Derek Slater. At 32. Derek didn't usually stand out, though his build and military haircut hinted at a life of discipline. He was the type to lift quietly, speak softly, and avoid conflict. But when Silas removed his sweatshirt, Derek stopped mid-rep and froze. His dumbbell hovered for a moment, then clanked softly against the mat as he let it drop. His eyes widened, not just with recognition but something deeper, something ancient. His breath caught in his throat. "No way," he whispered to himself. Derek's knees moved before his mind did. He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, ignoring the eyes now turning toward him. His jaw was clenched, his gaze locked onto Silas's tattoo as if it were speaking in a language only he understood. The numbers. The faded, brutal simplicity of them. He had seen that style before. Not in books, not in movies, but in a photograph his grandfather once showed him on a rainy afternoon, decades after the war ended. It had been inside a leather-bound journal, brittle with age and lined with handwritten entries. Derek remembered sitting cross-legged in his grandfather's attic, watching the old man's calloused fingers turn the pages like they were glass. There, nestled between yellowed letters and a folded American flag, was a photo of a young boy, black, thin as a skeleton, his eyes too hollow for his age. His arm bore a number that started with an A and ended in ink-stained silence. Derek's grandfather had pointed to the boy and said, "I held him in my arms when the gates opened." He didn't cry, not even once. And now that boy, older, fragile, still marked by the war, was sitting on a bench in a Virginia gym, struggling to breathe after lifting a 10-pound dumbbell. Silas. Derek crouched slowly before the old man, not daring to speak yet. Their eyes met, and for a flicker of a moment, it was as if time melted. Silas didn't flinch, but there was a flicker something in his pupils that read not fear but fatigue. The kind of fatigue that comes from remembering too much. "You were there," Derek finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Silas nodded once. It was all he could manage. The room had grown quieter still. Someone lowered the music volume, almost instinctively. Trainers paused mid-session. Whispers flickered through the space like sparks on dry wood. Wait, what's that number mean?
That's some prison thing, right?
No, someone whispered. That's not prison. That's Holocaust. And just like that, the floor seemed to shift beneath everyone's feet. A Holocaust survivor. Here, in this gym, in this town, hiding in plain sight behind a trembling arm and a worn hoodie. The disbelief was thick, uncomfortable, and electric. Zayden's knees wobbled beneath him. He knew about the Holocaust vaguely. School had glossed over it. Names and dates, maybe a slideshow once a year, but nothing had prepared him for this. To stand feet away from someone who'd lived through it, someone whose skin had been branded by genocide, and worse, someone he'd mocked. Micah leaned against the wall, suddenly pale. I thought they were all dead, he mumbled. No, Derek said without turning, still kneeling. Some lived. Barely. He reached out, gently touching Silas's hand. Silas didn't pull away. And then, something changed. Silas's eyes fluttered, his lips parted slightly, his breathing turned shallow and irregular. One hand clutched his chest, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Mr. Boone? Derek asked, alarm rising in his voice. Silas leaned forward, unsteady, his pupils dilated. A faint sheen of sweat formed across his forehead. The tremble in his arms intensified, but now it wasn't just age, it was something else. Get help, someone shouted. A woman ran toward the front desk. Zayden remained rooted in place, helpless. Silas tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Derek leapt forward instinctively, catching the old man before his body could hit the floor. Call 911, a man yelled. Silas's head lolled back. His eyelids fluttered. A single name escaped his lips in a breathless whisper. David. Derek's arms tightened, gently lowering him to the ground, cushioning his fall. His heart pounded, not from panic, but from something worse, recognition. David, his grandfather's name. Stay with me, Derek said firmly. Don't you dare go anywhere, sir. Not now. Silas didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, erratic. A circle had formed. Phones were raised again, but not to mock this time, to document, to share, to understand. Zayden stared, horrified. A lump formed in his throat, that he didn't understand, only that it burned. And then the unexpected twist landed like a hammer to glass. A trainer who had stepped back into the office emerged with a folder paperwork Silas had submitted when he joined the gym. She held it up, confused. His emergency contact. It's not a relative. Derek turned. The woman frowned. It says the name is Derek Slater. That's you, isn't it? Derek's face went pale. What? The room stood still once more. Why would Silas name him someone he didn't know as his emergency contact? Unless Silas had known who Derek was all along and had come here for a reason. As the paramedics burst through the door and lifted Silas onto a stretcher, Derek stared down at the folder in his hands. Inside was a photograph, not of Silas, but of a young soldier kneeling beside a black child in striped clothing. Scrawled on the back, in shaky handwriting, "Find the boy who kept his promise." And suddenly, Derek realized he wasn't here to save Silas. Silas had come here to save him. The ambulance flashing lights had long faded into the distance, but the shock remained. Hours later, after tests and a quiet release from the ER, Silas Boone sat silently in the passenger seat of Derek Slater's black Ford Explorer. The old man's head leaned against the window, the cool glass a small relief against the pounding storm of old memories he hadn't intended to unleash. Not like this. Derek drove without music, without chatter. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, reverent. He stole glances at the frail figure beside him, once just a stranger in the gym, now someone tied inexplicably to his bloodline, to his past. The photo in his coat pocket, taken generations ago, had grown heavier with every mile. Left on Jasper Street, Silas said finally, voice raspy. The words cut through the air like gravel, over concrete. Derek obeyed, tires crunching over a cracked road that led into one of the older neighborhoods. Brick apartments stacked like weary soldiers, rusted mailboxes, paint peeling from doors that had seen too many winters. Silas's building stood at the corner, nondescript 4 stories with a broken light flickering above the entrance. They ascended the narrow staircase slowly. Silas refused the elevator. Inside apartment 3B, the scent of old wood and cloves lingered. It was modest, barely decorated, but meticulously kept. No modern television. No smart devices. Just a vintage radio in the corner, a small bookshelf, and a worn recliner beside a dusty heater. The walls, however, told another story. Derek turned slowly in place, his breath catching. Dozens of framed photographs lined the room. Black men in uniform, sepia-toned images of soldiers grinning despite muddy boots and bent rifles. Some bore American flags, others foreign insignia. One entire wall had maps. Europe in the 1940s, with pins stabbed into cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Cologne. Scribbled notes covered the margins in faded ink. Silas dropped into his recliner with a sigh. That wall, he muttered, nodding toward the left, is where the history they never teach still breathes. Derek stepped closer. One photo stood out. A child, no older than 8, skin dark, hair cropped close, dressed in striped camp clothing too large for his frame. He was being held by a white soldier, and both stared into the camera with haunted eyes. The child's wrist, barely visible, bore the same numbers Derek had seen just hours ago. "It's you," Derek whispered. Silas nodded once. "And the soldier was your grandfather, Sergeant Thomas Slater." Derek's throat tightened. "I didn't make you my contact by accident," Silas continued. "I knew who you were the first time I saw you at the gym. That chin, those shoulders, you're the mirror of the man who lifted me out of hell." Silence filled the room again. Derek sat slowly, unsure if he was dreaming or witnessing history fold into itself. How were you even there?" he finally asked. "You're American. I thought—" "I'm not just American," Silas interrupted. "I was born in Germany, 1939, to a woman who should have known better, and a man who wasn't allowed to love her." He gestured toward a small photo frame on the table beside him. Derek leaned forward. The image was grainy, but clear, a beautiful light-skinned woman, her hair tied in a 1940s-style scarf, standing beside a dark-skinned soldier in uniform. They smiled, but something in their posture hinted at urgency. "My mother, Miriam Weiss, German Jew. My father, Corporal Elijah Boone. Stationed in Rhineland. After the First War. Stayed longer than he should have." Silas's voice thinned. "When the Nazis came to power, I was classified as a Rhineland bastard." Derek's brow furrowed. "I've never heard that term." "Few have," Silas said bitterly. "They erased it. A quiet genocide. Children like me, born of African soldiers and white German women, were considered pollutants to the Aryan bloodline. They sterilized many, tortured others. When I turned 5, they took me from my mother. When I turned 6, they took her too." The words sank like anchors. "I was too dark to be German. Too Jewish to be left alive. I wasn't supposed to survive. I wasn't supposed to speak their language, let alone remember." Derek felt his chest tighten. The weight of the gym's laughter, of Zayden's phone camera, came crashing back like a tidal wave. Silas wasn't just a survivor of atrocity. He was its embodiment, living proof of hatred that had twisted through continents and centuries. Silas slowly stood and walked to a small locked chest beneath the bookshelf. His fingers trembled as he removed a key from around his neck, the chain barely holding. He knelt, unlocked it, and pulled out a velvet pouch. From it he removed a worn black and white photograph, creased, but unmistakable. 6 American soldiers posing beside a liberated camp fence. Starving survivors stood in the background, ghost-like. One soldier was crouched beside a small boy. "Your grandfather was the first man who didn't flinch when he saw me," Silas whispered. "He didn't call me a freak, didn't treat me like broken glass. He shared his food, sang to me, carried me 3 miles on his back until we reached the medic tents." Derek reached for the photo. His fingers brushed the edge. His heart thundered. "I always wondered if he remembered me," Silas said, his voice cracking. "I spent years searching, letters unanswered, archives denied. But when I moved here 2 years ago, and saw your name on that gym sign-up list, I knew I had found someone who might carry the weight." Derek looked up, shaken to his core. "Why didn't you say something?" Silas met his eyes. "Because your generation doesn't listen. Not until something goes viral. Not until someone cries." And in that moment, Derek realized something deeper. This wasn't just about trauma. It was about erasure. About a man carrying decades of pain that no classroom had ever spoken of. About how racism could mutate across borders, across history, and still find its target, no matter how far one ran. "Mr. Boone," Derek began. But the old man held up a hand. No speeches, just look. He reached back into the box and pulled out another item. A small rusted dog tag with a dented edge and a single faded initial TS. Derek's fingers trembled as he took it. This was his. Silas nodded. He gave it to me before we were separated. Said, if I don't make it home, you carry this for me. Derek stood, unable to contain the tide within him. He turned away, breath hitching. He never told me. He never spoke about the war. Because it wasn't just war, Silas said softly. It was witnessing what humans become when they stop seeing each other as human. As Derek gripped the dog tag, heart pounding, Silas reached into the chest once more and pulled out one final photograph, this one newer, colored and crystal clear. It was of 6 American soldiers standing in a desert, one of them unmistakably Derek himself. But Silas had never been in Afghanistan, never left the country in decades. How did you get this? Derek asked, voice hollow. Silas looked at him and said, because someone's been watching you too. And you were never just a witness. You were meant to finish what he started. The photograph in Derek's trembling hands was unmistakable. He stood in desert fatigues, sun casting hard shadows across his face, flanked by fellow Marines. He remembered the mission, Kandahar, 2010, but this image had never been public. It had never left the secured servers of the military database. How did you get this? He asked again, voice low, caught between suspicion and fear. Silas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned, opened a drawer from the dusty oak desk in the corner, and retrieved a worn leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked, corners frayed, and a faint symbol barely visible was etched into the center, a Star of David, inside a broken chain link. This, Silas said, placing it gently on the table between them, is the part no one believes unless they read it themselves. He slid the journal toward Derek, then leaned back with the weight of years crushing his spine. Derek hesitated, then opened to the first page. A date scrawled in pencil caught his eye. March. The first entry was written in shaky German, but translated below in Silas's steady, slanted English handwriting. Mother kissed my forehead and whispered, "Don't let them erase your name." She didn't say goodbye. She never did. The cart smelled of rust and wet straw. I was cold. I was quiet, and I never saw her again. Derek's breath caught. The words were soft, but they echoed through him like cannon fire. Silas cleared his throat, eyes unfocused. A neighbor, a Polish woman, helped smuggle me out of Mannheim. My father had vanished months earlier, most likely taken to a labor camp. My mother begged her to hide me. For a few weeks I lived in a cellar. Then someone told the SS. Derek flipped pages. Slowly. Each entry deepened the descent. There were sketches, barbed wire, gaunt faces, watchtowers, and then a sudden shift. They tattooed my number that morning. I didn't cry, not because I was brave, but because the boy next to me, Miklos, was deaf, and they did him first. He didn't know what was coming. He screamed until his throat bled. Silas's voice was steady, but far away. They didn't understand what I was. Too dark to be Aryan. But my records showed a Jewish mother. I was a dilemma, a contaminant. Dr. Mengele took interest in that. Derek blinked. You met Mengele? Silas nodded. Barely, briefly. Once. He called me a genetic riddle. But I wasn't special enough for his table. I was handed off to another unit, where they tested endurance, starvation, and the psychological effects of isolation. I wasn't a boy to them. I was a flaw to be studied. There was no emotion in his delivery, only exhaustion. I shared a barracks with others like me. The forgotten groups, Roma children, disabled men, black prisoners brought from French colonies. We didn't speak the same language, but pain needs no translation. Derek kept reading. Abdul was missing fingers. He sang to himself in Wolof when he was afraid. Marie walked with a limp and used her belt as a pillow. We held each other when it snowed. We cried when the bodies piled too high to move. Abdul and Marie, Silas whispered. They were my world in that place. We shared rations, shared dreams of escaping. One night, guards took Abdul. He never came back. They said he'd been selected for clearing. Marie refused to eat. After that, Silas's fingers moved gently across the table's surface, remembering touches long gone. I don't remember how long I was there, he continued. Days blurred. 1 week, they put us in a freight cart and drove us into the woods. It was supposed to be a transfer, But the engine broke down. The guards panicked when planes flew overhead. They left us locked inside. Derek leaned forward, gripped. Your grandfather found us. His unit opened that door. I was at the bottom of a pile, crushed but breathing. He flipped toward the journal's end. There, clipped between the final pages, was a faded newspaper article. Allied troops liberate camps. The photo was of white soldiers only. There were no black men in this story. Silas said bitterly. No mention of Corporal Slater. No mention of the first hands that lifted us out. The camera waited until after they'd moved on. Derek clenched his fists. That's erasure. That's America, Silas corrected. It wasn't just Germany that wanted people like me invisible. It was everywhere. Here too. The unexpected twist stung. We weren't just victims of fascism, Silas said. We were victims of memory. When the world decided which stories were worth telling, we didn't make the cut. Derek looked up, his chest hollow. Why didn't you leave? Go somewhere that cared. Silas laughed, dry and sharp. Where would that be? Show me a country in 1945 where a black Jewish orphan wasn't seen as a mistake. Derek sat back, stunned into silence. I came to America because it promised freedom. Instead, I was spit on, locked out of schools, told my Hebrew name sounded terrorist. I spent the first 10 years hiding my past. I spent the next 40 trying to remember it. He tapped the journal. That's why I wrote all this down. Because I knew one day you'd come looking. Derek felt a strange heaviness behind his eyes. Me. Your grandfather made a promise, Silas said. To tell the truth. I think he couldn't bear it. But you were different. You've seen war too. You've seen what men can do when they think someone's beneath them. Derek looked at the photo again. The boy curled in Thomas Slater's arms. It was more than resemblance. It was inheritance. Pain passed down like family silver. Silas, Derek whispered, voice choked. I'm sorry. For everything. Silas didn't accept it. He didn't reject it either. I never hated the ones who hurt me, he said finally. I feared the ones who watched. The words hit harder than any accusation. They were an indictment, not just of Nazis or soldiers or politicians, but of every bystander, every teacher who skipped the chapter, every friend who looked away, every gym full of teens who laughed while history tried to lift a dumbbell. Before Derek could respond, Silas reached beneath the chair cushion and pulled out a letter sealed in wax. He handed it to Derek without explanation. Derek cracked it open and unfolded a thin sheet of stationery. It wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to Zayden Cross, and at the top, written in Silas's shaky handwriting, was a title. To the boy who laughed too soon. Derek Slater didn't remember the drive home. The roads blurred, the houses faded past, the hum of tires became white noise. His mind was miles behind, still in that dim apartment, with walls thick with untold history, still clinging to Silas Boone's words like a man gripping a lifeline. The sealed letter to Zayden lay in the passenger seat, untouched, too heavy with implication. He couldn't even look at it. When he stepped into his home, it felt colder than usual, not in temperature, but in weight. The framed flag above the fireplace, the old medals in the display case, the photos of his deployment, they now felt like props in a theater of half-truths. He dropped his keys on the counter and sat on the edge of his couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it might open up and offer clarity. But nothing came. So he stood and walked toward the attic. His grandfather, Thomas Slater, had passed 15 years ago. A quiet man, modest even in his heroism. He rarely spoke of the war, except in vague references and fragmented memories. But Derek remembered one thing clearly. There's a box up there, in the attic. When I'm gone, open it when you're ready, not before. Derek hadn't touched it. Not until now. He pulled the attic stairs down, climbed slowly into the dust-choked space, and found the wooden trunk buried beneath old linens and faded Christmas lights. He pulled it forward, knelt, and opened it. Inside were items that felt like echoes, folded uniforms, yellowing letters, a leather belt with a cracked buckle, a few crumpled photographs. But near the bottom, beneath a pair of polished dog tags, he found a bundle of handwritten pages tied in twine. The first was dated June 17th. His grandfather's looping cursive filled the page. He didn't cry when we pulled him out. Not once, just stared like he'd already buried everyone he loved. The other soldiers, they looked at him like he was a ghost. I couldn't stop thinking. He was only a child, but already older than all of us. Derek sat back, heart pounding. Each page unfolded more than just memory. It unspooled guilt, regret, and helplessness. His grandfather had written about Silas repeatedly, about his silence, his resilience, and the haunting fear in his eyes that never quite faded. "They wouldn't let me take him," one entry read. "I tried, filed forms, wrote letters, told them he had no family left, that I could give him one. But command said he wasn't eligible, said his ethnic status complicated things." Derek's hands shook as he read the next line. A black Jewish orphan didn't fit the criteria for adoption by an American soldier, especially not in a segregated unit. They said bringing him home would confuse the community. He felt his stomach twist. It wasn't just racism abroad. It was sewn into the seams of the system his grandfather had fought for. The very country that praised liberation overseas had barred compassion at home. His grandfather had been ready to raise Silas, to love him, to save what little remained of a shattered childhood, and had been stopped by paperwork soaked in bigotry. Another entry. September. I left him with the Red Cross. Told them to find him a safe place. He smiled when I gave him my dog tag. Said he'd keep it forever. That's when he finally cried. Just once. I haven't forgiven myself for walking away. Derek closed the letters, eyes burning. The pain he felt wasn't just his own. It was inherited. Carried like a dormant wound passed down through silence. He walked to the living room and sat heavily. Everything inside him was trembling, not with rage but a deeper sorrow. For Silas. For his grandfather. For the cost of history that never made it into textbooks. His phone buzzed. A text from Zayden's school counselor. "Are you still available for Thursday's veteran talk? Zayden seems different lately. Might be good for him to hear from someone real." Derek stared at the screen, then at the sealed letter addressed to the boy who had laughed. He hadn't even read it, but he knew what it must contain. Not scolding, not anger. Silas didn't carry those emotions like most men did. He carried perspective, weighted with the depth of someone who'd watched humanity collapse, and still survived. Derek picked up the letter, slid it into his coat, and stood. He had to do something. Not just to honor Silas. Not just to ease his grandfather's long-buried regret. But because the world didn't deserve another silenced story. Not this time. He returned to the attic, grabbed the letters, the dog tags, the photo of his grandfather and young Silas, and placed them into a worn briefcase. He made one call, to a friend who worked at the local newspaper, then another to a Holocaust research center, in D.C., and then he sat back down, opened his laptop, and began typing. "My name is Derek Slater. I'm a Marine veteran, grandson of a World War II soldier. I'm writing to you because there's a story America never told." He poured everything onto the screen. The gym, the tattoo, the diary, the injustice, the silence. He attached scanned copies of the letters, photos. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He told the truth, and hit send. The past had tried to bury itself, but he was going to dig it up. As he closed his laptop, his phone buzzed again. This time, a blocked number. He answered hesitantly. A woman's voice, calm, measured. "Mr. Slater, this is Agent Lowell from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We need to speak to you about a classified adoption file connected to Sergeant Thomas Slater. Something's surfaced, and we believe it may change everything you thought you knew." The video was only 17 seconds long. 17 seconds of laughter, a close-up of trembling hands, and Zayden's whisper over distorted bass. "Parkinson's curls, bruh. Watch Grandpa try not to break." It hadn't even been posted by Zayden directly. Trent had snagged a copy and uploaded it to a meme account, with over 40,000 followers. The caption read, "When the retirement home invades your gym." By the time Zayden woke up the next morning, it had over 300,000 views. He stared at his phone screen in disbelief, eyes red from lack of sleep. Notifications poured in like an avalanche. Likes, retweets, duets, remixes. People were adding their own cruel captions, distorting Silas's image into a walking punchline. Hashtags trended, Jim Boomer, Tremble Flex, Silas Slam. And then the backlash arrived. Because someone buried in the replies had recognized the numbers on Silas's arm. A blurry screenshot of the tattoo was zoomed in, reposted with the caption, "Hold up, is this a Holocaust number?" Everything flipped. Within hours, Holocaust educators, veterans, historians, and activists flooded the comments. What had started as a viral joke mutated into a public reckoning. The video was reposted on Reddit with the headline, "Teen Mocks Holocaust Survivor at Gym, Internet Furious." Zayden stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. The top comment had 58, "This is what happens when history is erased. We raise kids who laugh at genocide survivors." Another read, "That old man is Silas Boone, one of the last living Black Jewish Holocaust survivors. Do your research before you open your mouth." Zayden tried to delete the post, but it was too late. Screenshots were everywhere. TikToks dissected his voice. Instagram stories highlighted his smirk. People zoomed in on his face, tagging his school, demanding action. His name was out. His school email was doxed. And suddenly the inbox that once buzzed with basketball tryout reminders and meme chains now spat venom. "Racist clown. You'll never get into college. Hope you feel big laughing at genocide." Zayden didn't eat that day. His mother found him curled on the floor of his room, blanket over his head, phone clutched in a trembling hand. "Zay, baby, what happened?" she whispered, gently pulling the blanket back. He couldn't answer, couldn't form words. The pressure in his chest wouldn't loosen. The shame burned too hot. By the next morning, cancel Zayden trended locally. A petition circulated demanding his expulsion. Another TikTok called for his scholarship reviews to be suspended. He walked into school surrounded by whispers. Teachers avoided his eyes. Students stared, some recording him like a zoo exhibit. His locker was defaced with the words, "Ignorant, bigot, rogue." By fourth period he was called to the office. The principal, Mr. McKinney, didn't waste time. "You're suspended until further notice," he said, voice cold. "Pending a full review. We're cooperating with district authorities and law enforcement." Zayden didn't speak. He just nodded, picked up his bag and walked out. He never made it to the parking lot. A group of reporters waited near the school gates. Local news, campus blogs, even a national outlet. "Zayden, do you regret what you said? Have you spoken to Mr. Boone? Are you aware of his history?" He turned and fled down the side alley, the sounds of flashing cameras haunting his every step. By the time he got home, he was shaking. His father, usually silent about discipline, pulled him aside that evening. "Son," he said, voice low and worn, "do you know what kind of wound you've opened?" Zayden's voice cracked. "I didn't know. I didn't mean." "Intent doesn't matter when ignorance hurts," his father said. "The world don't care if you meant it. They care that you said it, that you laughed." The silence afterward was brutal. For days, Zayden didn't leave the house. He deleted his socials, turned off his phone, refused to respond to classmates reaching out, some to taunt, others to offer fake sympathy. He sat in front of his laptop searching desperately Silas Boone history, Black Holocaust survivors, Rhineland bastards. Each click deepened the crater inside him. And then he found it, a scanned excerpt from a museum archive. A picture. Silas, as a child, wrapped in a too large striped uniform, staring hollow-eyed at the camera. The caption read, "One of the only known Black Jewish child survivors of Auschwitz." Subject, Silas Boone. Zayden stared until his vision blurred. That night, he wrote an apology letter. Not for PR, not to avoid punishment, but because something inside him broke. "Mr. Boone, I mocked what I didn't understand. I turned your pain into content. I failed to see the human in front of me, and that's something I'll carry forever. I'm sorry." He never sent it. Because the next morning a knock came at the door. His mother answered, then called out, "Zayden, someone's here to see you." He came down slowly, unsure if it was another reporter. But standing in the doorway, tall, tired, leaning slightly on a cane, was Silas Boone, dressed in a neatly pressed sweater and slacks, his presence still quiet but undeniable. Zayden froze. "I heard you've had a rough few days," Silas said, his voice even, eyes steady. Zayden tried to speak. No words came. Silas didn't wait. "I didn't come here to punish you. I came because I believe silence is worse than shame." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "Open this when you're alone," he said. "And if you're still willing, I'd like to speak with you again, not as a survivor, but as a man who knows what it's like to be seen as less than human." Zayden took the envelope with both hands, eyes stinging. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know," Silas said, "but don't apologize for the internet. Apologize by what you do next." As Silas turned to leave, Zayden tore open the envelope. Inside was a single, typewritten sentence. "If you want to know who you really are, meet me at the park bench beneath the oak tree, where they used to not let boys like you sit. The park was almost empty that morning. Muted sunlight filtered through the branches of a towering oak tree, casting long laced shadows onto the bench beneath it. The breeze carried the scent of dew and earth clean, undisturbed, almost sacred. It was a place where history waited without complaint, patient and unseen. Zayden Cross stood at the edge of the path, unsure whether to approach. He had barely slept. The envelope Silas gave him still sat in his back pocket, the bench mentioned in the note standing 20 feet away. He had walked past this tree 100 times in his life. Never once had he sat beneath it. His grandmother once told him that there were benches in town that weren't made for us. He'd laughed at the time, young and clueless, brushing it off as a relic of a past too distant to be real. But this tree, this bench, this was one of them. And now Silas Boone sat there, unmoving, watching the breeze shuffle fallen leaves like forgotten stories. His cane rested beside him, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. He didn't look up when Zayden stepped forward. Didn't speak. Just waited. Zayden approached slowly, and sat at the far end, unsure of the rules here, unsure of whether he belonged. They sat in silence for a long minute. No phone. No noise. Just time. And then Silas reached into the worn canvas bag at his side and pulled out a photo, creased and nearly torn at the edges. He didn't pass it over. He simply held it between them, eyes never leaving the image. Zayden leaned closer. The picture was in black and white. A tree, not unlike the one they sat under. A man, clearly a soldier, hung from its branches by the neck, boots dangling lifelessly above the grass. His uniform was American. Zayden's breath caught. Silas finally spoke. Taken in 1944. Mississippi. They lynched him 2 weeks after he returned from liberating a Nazi camp in Germany. Zayden turned toward him, throat tight. He wore the same uniform. Silas continued, voice low, bled for the same country, came home to the same flag. But when he stepped off that train, all they saw was a black man in boots too proud. Zayden blinked rapidly, his vision blurring. That soldier was my father, Silas said. Corporal Elijah Boone. Never made it to the photo albums. Never made it to the parades. Silas laid the photo on the bench between them. White soldiers from his unit got medals. He got silence. He got a rope. The wind shifted. Zayden stared at the image, his stomach curling with guilt, shame, and something else, recognition. Because he had mocked Silas's weakness without ever asking what it had survived. Because he had never been taught this history. And worse, he had never looked for it. I didn't know, he whispered. I don't expect you to, Silas said. You're not taught to look back. You're taught to move forward even if it means stepping over graves. Zayden lowered his head. I'm sorry. I know, Silas replied softly. But sorrow doesn't change the ground beneath our feet. Zayden reached for the photo, hands trembling, but Silas gently placed his hand over it first. Not yet. There was a pause. Then Silas reached into his coat again, this time retrieving a small velvet pouch. He untied it slowly and withdrew a tattered dog tag. Its surface was scratched, dulled with time, but one side was still readable. C. Boone, 3177-210, U.S. Army. Silas stared at it for a long moment, before holding it out to Zayden. This, he said, belonged to the man you remind me of. Zayden took it carefully, as if it might shatter in his palms. The metal was warm, as though it had never fully let go of the memory it carried. I don't understand, he said. Silas's eyes finally met his. You mocked me because I shook, because I looked fragile. But strength isn't measured in silence. It's in how much you carry and still keep walking. Zayden opened his mouth to speak, but Silas continued. My father fought in a war overseas while living in one here. He liberated prisoners from Europe and came back to find himself chained in his own country. He taught me to never let hate define my limits. But I forgot that lesson, until you reminded me. Zayden frowned. Reminded you? How? Because your ignorance wasn't rooted in malice, it was in absence, Silas said. And absence is how racism grows loudest. Zayden looked at the dog tag again. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like responsibility. What do you want me to do with this? He asked. Remember, Silas said, and make sure others don't forget. They sat in silence again, the kind that healed instead of harmed. The photo still lay between them, the weight of history balanced on a piece of rusted metal, and a 17-second mistake. For the first time, Zayden understood why this was a conversation without words. Because language could never fully contain the pain passed down through generations. But presence could. I don't deserve this, Zayden said finally. Silas gave a faint smile. Neither did my father. But he wore it anyway. A long shadow passed across the ground as clouds shifted above them. And then unexpectedly, Silas pulled out one last item. A folded paper. Crisp. Deliberate. He passed it to Zayden. Zayden unfolded it carefully. It was a copy of a military commendation. Issued posthumously. Dated July. Zayden looked up, confused. But, I thought you said he never got recognition. Silas's jaw clenched. He didn't. I forged that. I made it up. Because sometimes the lie of honor is the only thing we're allowed to leave behind. Zayden felt something shatter inside him. Not anger. Not grief. Just the raw, unspeakable truth of how deeply buried injustice could be. As Zayden turned to respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out slowly. One notification. Incoming email. Subject. Your video just changed my life. He opened it, expecting hate. Instead, the first line read, my grandfather was one of the black soldiers erased from the history books. I never knew until I saw your video. We need to talk. The email sat open on Zayden's cracked screen for nearly an hour before he moved. He read it again and again, each line tugging him deeper into a world he never knew existed. The sender was a college freshman named Amari Fields from Georgia. She wrote, my grandfather, Curtis Fields, was a Buffalo soldier. He helped liberate parts of France. We never saw him in textbooks. Never found his name in war exhibits. I found out 2 weeks before he died. The silence broke him. Your video, your mistake showed me I'm not crazy for wanting to know more. Zayden exhaled. Something in his chest cracked, not from guilt this time, but awakening. He minimized the window and opened a new browser tab. Search Black Soldiers World War II. Thousands of hits appeared. He filtered through museums, scholarly articles, buried blog posts. He found the Double V campaign, a 1942 movement led by black newspapers demanding victory abroad and victory at home, fighting for democracy in Europe and against racism in America. He clicked images, rows of black men in uniform, rifles in hand, medals on their chests, faces proud, weary, often ignored. He read about the 7061st Tank Battalion, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Port Chicago disaster stories of valor met with betrayal. Men who risked their lives for a flag that called them unequal, the moment they stepped off foreign soil. Zayden leaned back in his chair, eyes stinging. Why didn't we learn this? He grabbed his social studies textbook from last semester, flipped to the WW chapter. Nothing. 3 sentences on the Tuskegee Airmen. No mention of the Double V campaign. No photos of black units. Just white generals. Grainy images of Iwo Jima. And a sanitized narrative of American glory. His hands tightened around the pages. Anger wasn't just a spark now. It was a slow, controlled fire. He didn't want to post an apology video. He wanted to understand how he'd been trained not to care. He messaged Amari, can we talk? They connected over video that night. Amari appeared on screen with thick glasses, a bookshelf behind her, and a face that held wisdom beyond her age. I'm glad you reached out, she said. Most people disappear after they get exposed. I deserve to, Zayden admitted. But now I need to do more than be sorry. They talked for an hour. She told him about her grandfather's journal entries, about how he'd been refused burial in a white veteran cemetery. She showed him scanned letters from army officials, rejections dripping in coded language. Zayden listened, wrote notes, asked questions he didn't know he had. And then he said it out loud for the first time. I want to do something. At school. Something big. Like an event. Amari raised an eyebrow. What kind? Zayden's heart beat faster. An event to remember all the ones who got left out. A tribute. A correction. He stopped, finding the words. Something called Silenced Soldiers. The title landed like a stone in a still pond. Amari leaned closer. If you're serious, I'll help you build it. The next day, Zayden met with Ms. Emery, the school's African-American history teacher. She looked surprised to see him. I didn't think you'd come back so soon, she said cautiously. I need your help, he replied. He laid out his plan. A school-wide event to honor black and marginalized soldiers of World War II. A gallery of forgotten stories, a film screening, a guest speaker. Even Silas Boone, if he agreed. Ms. Emery leaned back in her chair, arms folded. This school doesn't even teach Black history outside of February, she said slowly. You sure you're ready to push against that wall? I have to, Zayden said, because I helped build it. She watched him for a moment longer, searching his face. Then she nodded. I'll back you. But you'll need more than a teacher behind this. By the week's end, Zayden had formed a student committee, kids from debate, art class, even the soccer team. Some joined out of curiosity, others out of solidarity. A few just wanted to be part of the noise. He didn't care. He printed flyers, built a proposal, asked Amari to help him write a press release. Every night he read more, listened more. He learned about women like Charity Adams, soldiers like Dory Miller, the Red Ball Express drivers who kept supplies moving while dodging bullets and racism alike. Every page made him angrier and more alive.
He couldn't undo the 17 seconds.
But maybe he could make them mean something. The administration met with him, a board of stone-faced adults who questioned his motives, his preparedness, his timing. Is this a political protest, one asked. It's a correction, Zayden replied calmly, to the history we forgot to tell. They gave him a conditional green light. One day, one assembly, full teacher supervision. He agreed. That night he walked home under a sky thick with stars. And when he reached the park again, the bench beneath the oak, he found a single note taped to the wood, in Silas's handwriting. If memory hurts, that means it's still alive. Don't let it heal wrong. Zayden smiled. The next morning, as he entered school with a stack of flyers titled Silenced Soldiers, April 17, a secretary approached him with a puzzled expression. Zayden, she said, someone dropped this off for you. It was a package, unmarked. He opened it slowly. Inside was a faded military ribbon, a folded note, and a photograph of 6 Black soldiers standing beside a burned-down Nazi flag. On the back, written in typewriter ink, "Not all heroes made it into the books. Make sure they make it into hearts." The school hallway felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because Zayden had. He walked with the quiet weight of someone carrying more than a backpack, carrying names, stories, memories that didn't belong to him, but had been entrusted to him. The mockery that once defined him had calcified into responsibility. He didn't laugh as loud, didn't walk in groups. He had learned that growth rarely happens in crowds. Silenced Soldiers, April 7. The posters went up in the hallways that week. Bold black lettering on white backgrounds, no colors, no distractions, just each one carried a quote from someone history forgot. We fought Hitler abroad and Jim Crow at home. I was a liberator, not a citizen. Our medals were handed out in silence. Some students read them with interest. Some tore them down. But Zayden kept replacing them. The idea had spread quickly. Ms. Emery connected him with a network of Black veteran descendants and Holocaust educators. Amari helped him organize Zoom calls. They found men in their 80s who still had ration cards from the war, daughters who had never seen their fathers honored, and teachers who admitted they had to rewrite their own curriculums just to make space for these names. One call changed him permanently. An elderly woman named Viola Carr joined a session wearing a brooch shaped like the Liberty Bell. Her father had served with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion on D-Day. She held up his uniform, still pressed and spotless. My father never once saw his name in a textbook, she said, but he saw friends drown for a country that wouldn't let them sit in the front of a bus. Zayden nodded slowly. That's why we're doing this. The responses were overwhelming, some grateful, others skeptical, but the resistance hit hard from closer to home. In the cafeteria, Trent rolled his eyes as Zayden walked by with flyers. Oh, now you care about history? Please. I'm not doing this for attention, Zayden said quietly. You went viral for mocking a Holocaust survivor. Now you're Mr. Civil Rights. Come on. Others piled on. I bet he's trying to get extra credit. He's just trying to fix his rep. He probably got paid by the school or something. Zayden didn't respond. He just kept moving. Each whisper stung, but each step reminded him that the truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be told. That weekend he met with Mr. Levi Tannen, a Holocaust educator who had worked in Berlin for 20 years. They met at the public library, where Levi unrolled a timeline printed on parchment. You want students to care, Levi said, but not just with their heads. Make them feel it in their bones. Put faces to names. Show them what was erased. Zayden watched as Levi pointed to the photos. Black soldiers standing in snow, outside Nazi camps. A mixed-race boy, in striped pajamas. A synagogue burned beside a church that remained untouched. How do you keep doing this? Zayden asked. Levi smiled faintly. Because I've met too many people who still think history is something that happened to other people. Zayden left the library and walked home in the rain. Soaked but strangely alive. This wasn't just a school project anymore. It was an apology. A resurrection. A defiance. The next Monday, the auditorium approval came through. The principal had agreed to give him the entire morning schedule for silenced soldiers. Zayden printed name tags. Assigned speaking slots. Created display boards with Amari's help. Even his mother started volunteering, digging through newspaper archives and baking pastries for the event. Every night Zayden read something new. Every morning he woke up more committed. But the backlash didn't fade. His locker was tagged with a marker. Clout Soldier. An anonymous meme page photoshopped him into a fake Medal of Honor ceremony. Captions mocked his fake activism, accused him of chasing scholarships. Even Jalen stopped talking to him. You're too deep in, bro, he said. All this Holocaust, war, racism stuff. It's depressing. But Zayden didn't flinch, because every insult now felt smaller than the silence that had existed before him. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain brown envelope, slid under his family's door late one night. No name, no stamp. Zayden opened it on his bedroom floor. Inside was a single photo, sepia-toned, slightly blurred. A woman in her 20s, light-skinned, elegant even in a wool dress. Her eyes were wide, haunted but gentle. In her arms, a swaddled infant with dark skin and a halo of curls. Zayden turned it over. On the back, in looping handwriting, Miriam Weiss Boone, Silas's mother, Mannheim. Beneath it, in different ink, she died protecting mixed children from sterilization raids. She hid them in walls. Silas never knew until Zayden sat still, breath-catching. He didn't understand how the letter had reached him, or who had sent it. But what struck him hardest wasn't the image. It was the realization that Miriam had been erased too. Another name, another face the world tried to forget. And she had looked almost like someone he could have known. Like someone who would have smiled at him on a street corner. Like a mother. Zayden pressed the photo to his chest and whispered, I see you now. That night he emailed Silas the photo. But before he could close his laptop, a reply came not from Silas, but from an unfamiliar address titled,
Records recovered at usmilitaryarchives.org.
The message was one sentence long. We've located the last surviving member of the 7061st who served alongside Elijah Boone, and he's asking to speak with you. Zayden's fingers trembled as he clicked open the attachment. The email had arrived in the early hours, just after he'd sent Silas the image of Miriam Weiss Boone. He hadn't expected a response, let alone one from a military archive. But now, the screen lit up with a grainy black and white photograph. It showed two figures standing outside a collapsed stone house. The ruins behind them were still smoldering faintly, the earth scorched. A German village in winter, snow crusted on the rubble like dust over grief. In the foreground, a white American soldier stood beside a woman. She was unmistakable. Miriam Weiss Boone. Her arm clutched a child tightly against her side. The soldier's face was partly turned, his profile sharp, eyes fierce. His rifle hung diagonally across his chest. A cigarette dangled from his lips. The child was Silas. Zayden zoomed in. The soldier wore a patch on his sleeve, a triangle enclosing a Black Panther, 7061st Tank Battalion. But something else caught his eye. Barely visible on the man's collar was a name tag. T. Slater. Zayden's heart kicked into his throat. Derek's grandfather. He stared at the screen in stunned silence. The past had just twisted in, on itself, two bloodlines, separated by continents and war, suddenly connected in the still frame of a single forgotten photograph. One man, one woman, one child. A moment saved, never shared. He didn't know whether to cry or run. Instead, he picked up his phone and called Derek. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. Zayden? You good? I need to show you something, Zayden said. Now, please. An hour later, they sat at Derek's kitchen table, the photograph glowing on Zayden's tablet between them. Derek stared, eyes narrowing. That's him. You're sure? He nodded. That jawline, that patch, that's Thomas Slater. Zayden swallowed. The woman, that's Silas's mother. She was executed for hiding other mixed-race children. But before that, this photo proves she met your grandfather, that they were working together, maybe even saving lives together. Derek leaned back, stunned. He never told me. Not about this. Not about her. I think he couldn't, Zayden said. Maybe he wasn't allowed. Or maybe it hurt too much. They sat in silence. The picture, softly illuminated, looked less like a relic and more like a confession, an accidental testimony to a bond forged in defiance of everything their country had denied. It means, Derek said slowly, that our families were never really strangers. Zayden nodded. They were witnesses to the same fire. Derek stared at the screen a moment longer, then said, "You think Silas knows?" Zayden shook his head. "Not yet. He didn't mention your grandfather when he talked about that day. But this changes things." Derek exhaled and stood, pacing the floor. His voice dropped. "My family didn't want to talk about the war. Not really. My dad said Grandpa came back different. Quiet, angry sometimes. I think he carried this photo with him, maybe hid it so no one could erase it." Zayden leaned forward. "You could be the one to tell it now, at the event. Silenced soldiers. You should be the final speaker." Derek froze. "What? You're a Marine. You're part of this. And your grandfather, he wasn't just a soldier. He was a witness to racism in 2 countries. And he tried to save Silas's mother. You need to speak." Derek shook his head. "Zayden, I'm not a speaker. I'm not a teacher. I'm not. You're connected. That's more powerful than a podium." Derek turned away, rubbing the back of his neck. "I mocked that man in the gym," Zayden said, "and he still gave me history. He gave me a chance. Now you have the truth. And a voice. What else are you waiting for?" Derek didn't answer. Zayden lowered his voice. "Silas is risking everything to stand beside me. I can't carry this alone." The room pulsed with the kind of quiet you only hear when legacies shift beneath your feet. Derek sat back down, eyes on the photo. His face was hard to read, part disbelief, part fear, part something older. Zayden didn't push. He just placed a folded flyer on the table. "Silenced Soldiers, April 17, featuring veterans, educators, and survivors." A blank space was left at the bottom for the final name. Derek stared at it. Still silent. Zayden stood, nodded once, and turned to leave. Just before he opened the door, Derek called out softly, "Did you ever wonder how many people were buried with their names burned away?" Zayden turned. "Every day." Derek looked up, voice low. "Then maybe it's time I help unbury one." The next evening, Zayden received a call from a number he didn't recognize. A woman answered on the other end. "Is this Zayden Croft?"
Yes.
"I work with the Berlin Archive for Wartime Refugees. We received a request through your school's email system. A woman named Miriam Weiss-Boone. She didn't just hide children. She wrote letters, dozens of them." Zayden's breath caught. "Letters?" "Yes. And one of them was addressed to her son. It was never delivered. Until now." The school auditorium had never felt sacred until that morning. Rows of metal folding chairs replaced the usual bleachers. Students filed in with tentative curiosity. Teachers whispered with hands over their mouths, unsure of what to expect. The lights were low, the air dense with something more than anticipation, something ancestral, electric. Above the stage hung a stark banner in black and white block letters, "Freedom demands memory." There were no balloons, no theme music, no pep rally laughter, just silence. Zayden stood behind the curtain, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone clip to his collar. In his jacket pocket sat the folded photograph of Miriam Weiss-Boone and Thomas Slater, the photo that had changed everything. On the flash drive in his hand, names, images, and faces American history had long ignored. Beside him, Derek adjusted his tie, brow furrowed. He hadn't wanted the spotlight, but he had agreed. "We're not here to look heroic," Zayden had reminded him earlier. "We're here to unbury truth." A staff member poked her head through the curtain. "It's time." Zayden stepped onto the stage first. He scanned the crowd, teachers, students, local officials, a few faces he didn't recognize. And there in the second row sat Silas Boone, dressed in a dark blazer, a scarf around his neck, his thin hands resting on the arms of a wheelchair. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but his presence, silent and stoic, filled the room more than any applause could. Zayden's voice shook as he began. "We tell ourselves that history is about remembering heroes," he said, But sometimes it's about admitting who we forgot. The auditorium was still. He tapped the remote. The projector flickered to life, displaying a photo of the 7061st Tank Battalion. Black soldiers standing in mud, faces tired, defiant. The next slide, Jewish children behind barbed wire, one with dark skin, Silas. Zayden read off names, told brief biographies, shared audio clips of letters recovered from archives. One student behind him played soft piano chords. Simple, haunting. He told them about the Double V campaign, about the soldiers who liberated camps, only to return to segregated buses, about the silence that followed them home. Then came Amari's video call, projected on the screen. She spoke from her dorm room, surrounded by family medals and documents. "We have to stop teaching history like it's complete," she said. "It's not. It's ongoing. And we're all either part of the forgetting or the remembering." The audience leaned forward. Some wiped their eyes. Some took notes. Then Derek stepped forward. "I'm not here because I did something noble," he began. "I'm here because my grandfather made a promise he couldn't keep. And because a man named Silas Boone waited 70 years for someone to ask why." He told the story of the photograph, of Miriam, of how one soldier carried regret until his death, and how that regret shaped a family. When he finished, the room sat in silence for a full 10 seconds before anyone clapped. Then came a slow wave of applause, first cautious, then roaring. Zayden looked at Silas. The old man gave no nod, no tearful gesture, but his fingers gripped the arms of his chair just a little tighter. After the final slide faded, the curtain rose to reveal a tribute wall. Life-size photos of marginalized veterans, alongside handwritten notes from students. A table held mementos, ribbons, medals, faded journals. One display case held Silas's childhood shoes, recovered decades ago from a preservation box in Germany. They were impossibly small, worn at the edges. Crowds began to gather. A teacher sobbed softly as she read a note that said, "My grandfather never told me he fought. He said no one would believe him." Students moved through the exhibits, like it was sacred ground. Some touched the wall gently. Others whispered names under their breath. Derek leaned toward Zayden. "You think it's stuck?" Zayden nodded. "If it changed even one story, it's already history." Then a woman stepped forward, someone neither of them recognized. She wore a press badge. A small camera crew followed her. "I'm from Wang," she said, "NPR's documentary division. We got wind of this event from a veterans group. I've never seen anything quite like it. I'd like to cover this, full segment. Maybe a podcast too." Zayden blinked. "Really?" She nodded. It's time someone documented the erasure and the reckoning. As her crew panned the room, Silas remained seated, unmoving. She turned to him. "Mr. Boone, do you mind if I ask you a few?" But he raised a hand gently. "No recordings. Not of me." She hesitated, then nodded in quiet respect. Zayden stood beside him. "You good?" he whispered. Silas didn't answer, but he looked at the tribute wall for a long time. Then he whispered, "I can finally sleep." The crowd lingered for nearly an hour after the official end. Students hugged strangers. Veterans saluted portraits. Teachers whispered that the curriculum would never be the same. And just as the lights dimmed and the final guest exited, a school secretary hurried toward Zayden, holding a phone. "You need to take this," she said, wide-eyed. He pressed the phone to his ear. A male voice, low and weathered, spoke on the other end. "Zayden Cross. This is Staff Sergeant Lionel Carter. You and that Marine, you need to come down here. Now, what I have might rewrite everything Silas told you." The morning after silenced soldiers, the country felt different. Not because the world had shifted, but because the world had noticed. The event footage flooded social feeds. On TikTok, clips of Zayden reciting names of forgotten Black WWO veterans had racked up millions of views. A video of Silas Boone sitting silently beneath the Freedom Demands memory banner was now pinned to a viral thread titled, "When History Speaks Back." It was everywhere. And then, just as quickly, it began to fracture. The coverage split along familiar lines. Progressive blogs called it a necessary reckoning led by youth. Conservative pundits labeled it performative history laced with anti-American sentiment. An op-ed in a national paper posed the question bluntly. Is this redemption or propaganda? The writer argued that Zayden's arc was too tidy, that Derek's speech weaponized guilt, and that Silas's silence had been staged performance. Zayden sat in his kitchen, watching the piece trend in real time. "This isn't about us," he muttered, scrolling past headlines. "It was never supposed to be about us." But that wasn't how the media had packaged it. News outlets began framing Derek as the Marine who saved the story. His image saluting beside Silas was now the thumbnail for countless articles. Podcasts praised his courage. A viral tweet called him the white man brave enough to tell the truth about black pain. Derek hated every word. He shut his laptop and rubbed his eyes raw. "I didn't save anything," he said to no one. "I was just late." But the internet didn't care for nuance. In the comments under one of his speeches, a user posted, "So the Black Holocaust survivor sits quietly, while a white Marine tells us what matters. Got it." Another. Classic. System erases black soldiers, then gives the mic to someone white to correct it. Derek had prepared for backlash. But he hadn't prepared to become a symbol of the very thing he'd tried to dismantle. Zayden called him later that night. His voice was tight with frustration. "They're saying we hijacked it." "We?" Derek asked. "Both of us. Me for turning a racist moment into a redemption tour. You for whitewashing the pain." Derek paused. "They're not wrong to be suspicious." Zayden's voice cracked, but Silas was there. He saw it. He didn't say it was fake. "I know," Derek said quietly. "But the truth can't compete with a good headline." That night, the two of them sat on separate couches, miles apart, both staring at flickering screens that distorted something sacred into sound bites. In a town forum thread, a comment appeared. "Let's not pretend this was about history. It was about cleaning reputations. Old man in a wheelchair don't change a damn thing." Zayden closed his laptop and walked out into the night. He found himself back at the park, the same bench under the oak tree where he'd first met Silas after the fallout. The wind rustled the leaves above him. He sat in silence, the way Silas had, letting time press against his skin like history waiting to be heard again. The next morning he went to visit him. But the apartment was empty. Again. The door was locked this time. No neighbor had seen him in 2 days. Zayden called. No answer. He walked to the library, checked the museum where Silas occasionally volunteered. Nothing. Then he ran into Ms. Emery. She handed him an envelope with shaking hands. "It was left in my box," she whispered. "For you." Zayden opened it with Derek that afternoon in the school auditorium, surrounded by the remnants of the exhibit. It was a single sheet of paper. "There is no such thing as safe memory. You gave them something to feel, but they won't hold it for long. Make sure you do. When they erase me again, speak louder. No address, no location, just ink and ghost." Zayden folded the note slowly, the weight of it more than its paper. Derek said nothing at first. Then quietly. He knew this was coming. Zayden nodded. He knew it would fracture. They sat in the front row of the empty hall. The silenced soldier's banner still hung above the stage, curling slightly at the corners. Beneath it, Silas's chair sat empty. Zayden's voice was hoarse. "I thought telling the truth would fix something." "It doesn't fix," Derek said. "It just forces people to choose." As they sat there, the school secretary entered, wide-eyed, holding out a phone. "This just came for both of you," she said. A voicemail. Zayden pressed play. A man's voice crackled through, calm, southern, and graveled by age. "This is Staff Sergeant Lionel Carter. I served with Elijah Boone. You need to come to these coordinates. What I have, Silas never knew. And it changes everything." The GPS signal began to flicker as the tires crunched over a narrow gravel road, winding through rural South Carolina. The air was thick with pine and humidity, the kind that clung to your lungs like memory. Derek drove in silence, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter with every passing tree. Zayden sat beside him, holding a folded map that had been mailed, postmarked from a city Silas had never once mentioned. "You sure this is the right place?" Derek asked. Zayden double-checked the note. The coordinates match. The car crested a small hill and came to a slow stop in front of a white farmhouse, with a rusted roof and no mailbox. Beyond it, a field stretched wide, dotted with headstones worn smooth by time. At the far end of the property, a man stood beneath an oak tree, dressed in a weathered army jacket. He didn't wave. He just waited. "That's him," Derek murmured. They stepped out of the car. Staff Sergeant Lionel Carter looked every bit his age, close to 90, but still upright, his stare sharp beneath a faded cap. His skin was the shade of old bronze, his voice a low hum of gravel and wisdom. "You boys took your time," he said. "We didn't know what we were looking for." Zayden replied. Carter gave a faint smile. Then you're right on schedule. He led them past the farmhouse, through a narrow path bordered by crooked stones and nameless markers. Finally, they stopped at a patch of bare ground beside two headstones. One read, PVT, Henry Cross, 1970 Tank Battalion. Never came home, but never left. Zayden's breath hitched. That's my great-grandfather. Carter nodded. Fought beside Elijah Boone. Both black, both proud, both hated by the country they bled for. Your great-granddaddy died in France. Silas's father made it back, but the rope got him before his uniform did. Zayden knelt beside the grave, his fingers brushing the worn letters. He didn't have a funeral, Carter said. Not a real one. Buried behind a Baptist church that didn't put his name on the roll. Silas was too young to understand. Carter reached into his coat and handed Derek a sealed envelope. Silas gave me this. Told me not to open it until you came. Derek unfolded it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper. If memory is a battlefield, bury me with my brother in arms. Elijah fought the world, and lost. I fought the silence, and survived. We were both wounded by the same war. At the bottom, in Shaky ink, tell Zayden. Tell him this is where I belong. Zayden stood slowly, his heart pounding. He wants to be buried next to my family? He said your great-grandfather was the only man who ever sang to him when the shells fell, Carter said. Said he sang like he was fighting off the dark. Derek's voice cracked. Silas never mentioned this. Because he knew America wasn't ready for a story like that, Carter replied. A black Jewish orphan, who survived Nazis, and chose to rest next to another forgotten soldier in red clay. The air felt still, sacred, like history had stopped holding its breath. What about his paperwork? Derek asked. Will the VA approve it? I already handled it, Carter said. I made calls. Some of us old ghosts still have strings to pull. They spent the next hour walking the grounds, listening to Carter recount stories of late-night firefights, racist officers, of moments where soldiers became family, not because they shared skin or country, but because they shared survival. He paused at one stone marked only by a number. That, Carter said, was the code they branded into him. It was his prison, and he wanted it carved in stone, so the world couldn't forget again. Zayden's eyes stung. That number, it always looked like a scar. It was, Carter said. But now it'll be a monument. The burial was scheduled for the following weekend. A modest ceremony. No media, no crowds, just a promise fulfilled. Zayden and Derek made the arrangements. Silas's body had already been transferred. He had left behind no possessions, no next of kin, just a folded scarf, a notebook of diary entries, and a worn pair of shoes Zayden refused to throw away. The night before the ceremony, Zayden stood over his great-grandfather's grave, flashlight flickering in the dark. He whispered, "He's coming to join you. I hope you two recognize each other." Derek joined him, holding a sealed box.
What's that?
Zayden asked. Derek opened it. Inside, a pair of dog tags. One belonged to Silas, the other to Thomas Slater, Derek's grandfather. He would have wanted to be part of this too, Derek said. 3 men, 3 legacies, 1 graveyard that finally gets to speak. Just as dawn broke over the horizon, a pair of headlights appeared down the gravel road. A dark sedan pulled up slowly. Zayden squinted. The passenger door opened, and out stepped a woman, sharp-featured, eyes piercing, dressed in formal black. She carried a leather briefcase. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, voice steady. "But my name is Evelyn Rothschild. I represent a foundation in Berlin, and I believe one of these men is still legally listed as missing." The wind moved slow that morning, heavy with southern heat and something deeper, something sacred. By the time the sun had risen fully over the low hills of Greenwood Cemetery, cars were already lining the gravel roads that wove through the burial grounds. What was supposed to be a small, quiet ceremony had transformed into something else. Organic, unexpected, undeniable. They came in uniforms and Sunday dresses. They came with walking sticks, crutches, stroller wheels, bouncing against the dirt. They came from the local high school, from the church down the road, from 3 counties over. Strangers, students, veterans. Even the mayor came, standing awkwardly at the back, his tie slightly crooked. Zayden stood beneath the same oak where Silas's plot had just been dug, next to the stone that read, PVT, Henry Cross, 19 never came home, but never left. And now, beside it, a fresh stone. Silas Boone, 19, a survivor of the camps, a witness to a nation's forgotten. We 10. The number had been carved with intention, not as a label, but as defiance. Derek stood nearby, stiff in his dress blues, holding a folded flag in his gloved hands. He had insisted on presenting it himself, despite his unease with ceremony. Doesn't feel like I've earned the right, he told Zayden earlier. You didn't, Zayden said with a faint smile. None of us did. But he still gave it. The funeral began with silence. No music, no hymn. Just the soft rustle of leaves, and the steady murmur of grief. A local reverend, an old black man, who remembered Silas as the quiet brother who never missed a vote, led with a simple invocation. We are not here to bury pain. We are here to honor the ones who carried it so we wouldn't have to. Then came the trumpet. It was a young girl, no older than 14, trembling as she lifted the horn. The first note of taps cracked slightly, but no one flinched, because pain should never sound perfect. Zayden closed his eyes as the music wrapped around the crowd like folded cloth. When it ended, Derek stepped forward. He unfolded a small piece of paper and read aloud. Silas Boone was born between two wars, marked before he could speak, survived what no child should, and still he lived long enough to teach the ones who mocked him. He asked for no stage. So today we give him a place instead, a permanent one, beside another soldier who never got to sing his own story. He lowered the flag onto the casket. No applause. Just breathing. The town had come, but they didn't come for a show. They came because something in them had shifted. Among the guests, a woman held a photo of her grandfather, one of the black medics at Normandy. A teacher clutched a new lesson plan. A Holocaust survivor's son from Charleston drove 3 hours to stand at the back in silence. Even Trent and Jalen stood awkwardly near the middle, unsure of what to do with their hands. I didn't know, Jalen whispered. None of us did. That was the point. As the casket was lowered, Evelyn Rothschild from the Berlin Foundation stepped forward and laid down a single sheet of paper, Silas's mother's final letter, now translated and framed. Beneath it, a photo of Miriam Weiss Boone, holding baby Silas in her lap, with a caption, "She hid other children until they were safe." She never made it out. People cried openly now. Not because Silas had died, but because they had let him live that long unacknowledged. Zayden felt it in his chest like something blooming and breaking at once. This town will never be the same. Someone whispered. No, a teacher replied. Because now they can't say they didn't know. And then came the unexpected. As the last of the mourners drifted toward their cars, a male courier in uniform approached Derek. You Derek Slater? The man asked. Yeah. He handed over a weathered envelope, thick and yellowed. Came to the local post office yesterday. No return address. Just your name. Said it's from someone named Thomas Slater? Derek's jaw tensed. That's my grandfather. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a final letter, dated 3 days before Thomas Slater's death. Derek, if you're reading this, it means the ghosts finally spoke loud enough. I tried to bury them with my silence, but I failed. There's a photo in my drawer, me, Silas's mother, and the boy. I couldn't protect them all, but I carried her last request with me until the end. She gave me something the day we burned her house to hide the children's escape. A letter, sealed. She asked me to deliver it to her son. I failed her, but I didn't destroy it. It's hidden in the lining of my footlocker. If you're man enough to finish what I couldn't give it to him, make sure he knows she died singing his name. Derek's fingers shook. She had a message all this time, he whispered, and he never got it. Zayden stared at the letter, stunned. Where's the footlocker? Derek turned to him slowly. In my attic. As they stood there, a shadow passed overhead. A drone camera hovered silently above the cemetery, red light blinking, recording everything. Moments later, a notification buzzed on Zayden's phone. A new post. A hero's burial, or political theater. The caption. This morning in Greenwood, a controversial tribute brought together two histories, and reopened wounds some say were never meant to heal. The attic was silent as Derek and Zayden ascended the old wooden stairs. Their footsteps creaked in the dim light filtering through the dusty window. Derek brought a small lamp, its warm glow illuminating a battered footlocker in the corner. His grandfather's. This was his, Derek said softly, fingers trembling, as he lifted the lid. Inside, clothes folded tightly, a well-worn army cap, and beneath them, a sealed envelope, addressed to Silas Boone. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the handwriting elegant, but strong. Derek slid the letter to Zayden. "Will you read it with me?" Zayden nodded, voice unsteady. Derek unfolded the sheet. His eyes scanned the words silently. Then he cleared his throat. "To Silas's mother, Miriam Weiss Boone, I promise in this letter to protect your son. I carry him in my memory and my heart, beyond every war and every battlefield. If you fall, I will not let him." Derek paused, voice cracking. He wrote it before he left her house. Zayden swallowed hard. The weight of history compressed time. Two men separated by decades, bound by a promise that transcended blood. Derek continued, eyes dampening. "I failed. I brought Elijah home, but not Miriam. I buried this promise in my chest. Let it be my shame and my redemption. To you I commit his future." Silence hung between them, like a question waiting to be answered. Derek folded the letter and turned to the camera crew, seated in his den. Local journalists, invited for the morning's live interview. The headline would call it a revelation rooted in grace. Veteran's descendant fulfills promise, decades old. He took a breath. "Today I'm not just a Marine. I'm the grandson of a man who tried to protect a child he'd saved. And today I keep his promise." The reporter asked, "Why share this now?" Derek paused. "Because Silas died, believing he had to carry silence. But promises are not archival. They're living. They belong to the present." He held the letter. "I wanted the world to know. Our past isn't static. It shifts when we reflect. And sometimes small acts, like burying two forgotten soldiers side by side, echo louder than any national address." They aired live. Social media buzzed. Comments ranged from reverent, "This is the America we need," to skeptical, performative again. But the story changed. Not about image rehabilitation, but about legacy redemption. Meanwhile, Zayden spent his afternoons volunteering at Greenwood Veterans Outreach. He worked in the center's history room, cataloging letters from former service members, many black and unheralded, whose stories echoed Silas's. Each submission he filed felt like reclaiming a graveyard of erased lives. He taught group discussions about civil rights and military service. He spoke to teens who'd never considered how black soldiers shaped global events and domestic change. He spoke their names into classrooms, jamming outdated syllabi with truth. He carried the dog tags in his pocket, along with the wartime letter. It felt surreal. What started as a mocking video had become a movement of remembrance. Back at the gym, the mural was nearly finished. In the early morning light, the artist, an alum named Rosa, put the final touches on Silas Boone's image, a muscular, determined silhouette, lifting a dumbbell. The ink dipped in bold strokes. The words "never again" stretched under the scene, graffiti style, raw but hopeful. Silas, silent in repose, his tattoos faintly visible through sleeves, like history shining through scars. Zayden and Derek stood at a cautious distance as a small crowd gathered, students, veterans, locals. Cameras clicked silently. Zayden stepped forward. He knew every person in that crowd had seen him smile, stumble, learn. They had watched him fall and rise. They had allowed him to rewrite themselves. He tapped the mural. "This is more than paint," he said. "This is memory we can't walk away from. This is blood we owe to truth." Someone raised a camera, phone lights glowed, capturing the moment forever. He turned to Derek. "Thank you," he said, voice soft but sure, "for doing what you did, for showing me it's never too late." Derek nodded, eyes brimming. They left the gym together, men changed by words, promises, and guilt transformed into action. But the story had one last ripple. Days later, Zayden returned to the mural alone. A young boy no older than 6 stood before it, backpack still on his shoulders. The child studied the painting with wide eyes, his small hand pressed against the plump image of a dumbbell. "Mom," he said softly, pointing. "That's my great-grandpa." Zayden froze. The boy's mother, standing nearby, smiled and tucked his hand away. "Yeah," she said. "He never met him, but he's proud, just the same." Zayden watched them walk away. A whisper of déjà vu stirred in his chest. Because that boy's face looked just a little like someone he'd once mocked. The mural behind him echoed into the dusk. "Never again." A promise, repeated. In the fading light, Zayden turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. A woman in her late 20s, holding a folder packed thick. She paused just behind him, voice low and urgent. You need to see what else we found. Letters he wrote, after the war. Things he didn't want anyone to know until the last moment. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or even rethink what history chooses to remember, then be a part of something bigger. Subscribe to this channel to help us continue unearthing voices like Silas Boone's, voices buried under silence, racism, and time. And if this video meant something to you, share it. Let someone else feel what you just felt. Because stories like this deserve more than just a view.